We're going to do 5 classes, and what we have in the Megillah is we're going to, every biblical text, according to Jewish tradition, has a multiplicity of layers. We talk of speaking in the Torah of 4 dimensions called the orchard. Pshat, the simple surface, Remez, allusions, Drush, which is like midrash, and Sod, the mystical. So that's the 4, but in truth, our sages say there are 70 faces to the Torah. So 70 times 4, you would have, 280. But then they say for every soul, for each, there's another approach for each soul. 600,000 Jewish primary souls, the Jewish children of Israel that are counted as they leave Egypt are seen as the root souls of all future generations. So they say there's 600,000. So if you do 600,000 times 70 times 4, you get a feeling for what the levels and layers are in Torah. There's a belief that the text has omni-significance, that biblical text, that every part of it has meaning. So we don't just skip over things or explain them away. We try to find meaning. Now, the Book of Esther is at a surface a simple book. It's a story, like in other cultures. But how does it end up in the canon? How does it end up in our Tanakh? How does it end up a holy story? God is not even mentioned in the Book of Esther. Prayer is not mentioned. The only religious act you have there is fasting. I mean, it doesn't seem to be a very religious book. Now, feel free to interject. We have a small crew here, but you can raise your hand. There's a way with a button there. Maybe I'll see it, but or just wave. In the book itself, it tells us that this holiday will be celebrated by all Jews for all time. It makes a pretty radical prediction that will never disappear from your children. So when we celebrate Purim, we are establishing that the Jewish people have never died, have never gone away, we've never been usurped. And anyone that takes the title Jew, if they're not keeping Purim, then they're not following in those footsteps. But the method of celebration of Purim gives meaning to the text. In other words, realistically, how we read it and how we understand it gives meaning to it as well. What I'm trying to say is one of the challenges, if you're trying to be academic or looking at it from a historical point of view, is that the text has never been just a text. It's also been understood in many ways traditionally. In other words, just because I can give an interpretation, so the Torah has a multiplicity of meanings, but there still are primary approaches to the biblical text and to the story of Purim that have been used over generations. And that gives them not just a sanctity, but an authority. And this is going to be somewhat of our challenge because we're trying to cover the whole Megillah 5 times in 5 different ways. So this time, I just want to give the big picture. What is the message? What are the messages of the text and some of the motifs that we see here? Are there any thoughts that you would like answered as we go through these 5 classes about the story of Esther, the Megillah of Esther and Purim? If you have something, I'll make a note of it, and then we can come back to it at some point or integrate it into the text. So I have an old-fashioned pen and paper here. If anyone wants to, they have 30 seconds or forever hold your peace. Okay, 15 seconds. All right, feel free to interject. I'm not good at the countdown here. All right, so to me, what was always fascinating is you're reading this story that pre-archeology seemed to have no evidence. But then the last 100 years, the last 150 years, they uncovered ancient Shushan. Persepolis, this other palace of the Persian kings, it was excavated, and we have models of in much more detail. It was destroyed by the Greeks, both of these. But what we've uncovered are artifacts that actually shed light on the Purim story as well, which is fascinating. We have texts that from that period. Now, which exact king Ahasuerus was and when exactly the Purim story takes place, we don't have clarity. In other words, there's different opinions. Darius, Artaxerxes, Xerxes. We'll go through a little bit. I don't want to get too caught up because we don't really know the exact date of the story. And there's also a very famous discrepancy in the chronology of the rabbinic tradition and Herodotus and others of the Greeks who came later, as far as how many Persian kings there were and over how long a period did they rule after the Babylonians. So the exact date we're not sure of, but we get a feel for the kingdom and for the attitudes and what is taking place in the world. Okay, so to jump in, if we're looking at the biblical stories of that time, I'm going to do Jewish history in 30 seconds. Jewish history in 30 seconds goes like this. The Jews, 4,000 years ago, are in the land of Israel, Abram, Isaac, and Jacob. Their children and Jacob go down to join Joseph in Egypt because there's a famine in the land. They're enslaved. And after being there 210 years, although the biblical text says 400, that's counting from the birth of Isaac. So after 210 years, they go to the land of Israel. On the way, they wander the desert for 40 years. They come to the land of Israel, and they end up settling the land of Israel. The Assyrians come along about 700 years later and expel the 10 tribes, and a couple hundred years after that, the Babylonians destroyed the first temple. And after the Babylonians destroyed the first temple, so then the Persians and the Medes conquer the Babylonians. That's when you have the writing on the wall. Belshazzar, the grandchild of Nebuchadnezzar, is having a feast, and on the wall, a hand appears saying that you've been weighed and measured and found wanting. And Daniel the prophet interprets it, and ultimately that night, the Persians and the Medes conquer the Babylonians. After, when the Persians take over, at a certain point, we have the Ahasuerus story. At a certain point, we get permission to go back to the land of Israel and rebuild the Holy Temple. There were fits and starts because of different opposition from Samaritans and others who were enemies of the Jews. But ultimately, the second temple is built, and some of the Jews go back, the rest stay in Persia. After a while, Alexander the Great conquers the Persians, and then conquers the land of Israel, and then we have the Greek period. So far, we went through Egyptian, Assyrian, Babylonian, Persians, and Medes are together. Then we have the Greeks. And then after the Greeks come the Romans, and they destroy the temple 2,000 years ago. So we're still in the exile in traditional rabbinic thought, the exile of Rome, because the destruction of the temple was by Rome. Okay, so that's in a nutshell. The Purim story then happens chronologically before Hanukkah. Hanukkah is Greeks, Purim is Persians. They come before. Although in our year, Hanukkah will come before Purim, just to confuse everybody. Okay, so the Persian Empire is a very wealthy empire, tremendous amounts of gold, and wealth, as Alexander describes when he conquers it. They had conquered the Egypt and much of who had conquered the Babylonians. So they really had a tremendous amount of wealth. And what they're known for as well, among other things, is creating a system of government where you would have a local representative together with someone from the main head office down there. So someone who knew the country, knew the lay of the land, together with someone from the head office. Much like, the communists used to have someone who was a member of the Communist Party together with a local official. So they had they had a huge empire and they had to control it. And they had a wonderful postal system. So they were the ones with the runners and the horses that are throughout the Megillah. So they're really the first Pony Express. They were able to get from one side. They literally had like a Pony Express set up stations that you were able to get from one side of the empire to the other in a matter of days. I mean, truly incredible. So what happens is the period that we're talking about is known as, I believe we're pronouncing the Achaemenid Empire, which is, really with Cyrus the Great, although there are some mythical ancestors that come before that we don't know that much about. So Persia, led by King Cyrus. So we're using this as the tradition, the historian's chronology. They begin about 550 BCE. And they conquer most of the Fertile Crescent, Egypt, Anatolia. Persia is located in present-day Iran. So you get a picture. Includes Israel over here. So Cyrus is the one who gives permission to the Jewish people to go back to their land. And there's he describes. In the Torah, it describes how he gave permission to the Jewish people and he gave them back the vessels of the temple. This is going to be one of the themes that we're going to come back to, the temple. The question becomes for us, the story of Purim is when the Jews are in the diaspora. And it's very possible, based on the chronology, that the Jews had already been given permission to go back. Cyrus is for sure earlier. The Jews are given permission to return. And the Purim story is taking place with all the Jews who are still in Persia and outside the Holy Land. Only a small minority had gone up to Israel to build the temple. Now, there were periods where they would give permission to go back, and then they would give permission to build, and then they stopped the building. So when exactly it happened, we don't know. But there's a subtext to the story of Purim, which is the temple, which is the Jewish people returning to the Holy Land. So he allows people to go back, ultimately, and he is in the Torah. He's called Mashiach Hashem, the anointed one by God. That he was chosen for a specific mission to let the Jews go back, and he does that. And this is one of the earliest forms of the term Mashiach being used for a specific person. Okay. So the religion was Zoroastrianism, which has this dual vision of good and bad, and many can find in some of the magi, the priests of this religion, some elements that are similar to what's happening with Haman and casting lots and the superstition. Okay, so there are different kings. In the Torah, we only have mention of 4 to 6 kings, depending how you count. In the classical historians, there are 11 kings, but some of these kings may have ruled at the same time as others, some for less than a year, some were pretenders, and that was part of the challenges that they had. So eventually Alexander the Great conquers them and destroys these great palaces that we're trying to recreate for our purposes here. This is the cylinder. We have the actual cylinder that he inscribed as Cyrus, how he gave permission for all these nations to go back and worship their gods, which is incredibly similar to the language used in the Torah to describe that same event. one of the interesting things, this is by Darius, I believe, high up on these mountains. They carved these reliefs of different captives. But one of the things that they stress in his writings is how he rewards those who are good to him and he punishes those who are not. As we'll see in the Purim story, because they were paranoid. They're being poisoned all the time. So one of the elements here that runs through the Purim story is the paranoia that exists, not necessarily paranoia because of the palace intrigues that were taking place throughout that period. But he has this, he makes sure to stress that he rewards. This will come back later when he rewards Mordechai for saving his life belatedly. All right, the close-up. So these are different things that they've actually uncovered with these kings' signatures, stones. This is the stone that they uncovered in Shushan at the palace, the place that is the palace that we talked about in incredible detail. When they started excavating, by looking at the Megillah, they knew what they would find, because the Megillah describes in incredible detail the layout of the palace and its gardens and its dining halls or meeting halls and throne room, etc. So this is a cornerstone inscribed about the building itself that he was building. All right, and this is what's left. These things, each one, this is Persepolis, so we don't have this in Shushan, which was totally destroyed. But this is just a little glimpse, and we'll see a little more of his incredible wealth and power that he was busy showing off. But you get a feel of a world power that ruled all the Jews, and the Jews were very much under the thumb of the Persians. Okay, and this is a capital that's in the Louvre right now, top of the capital, top of a pillar, and you see the huge size of these things and how many people could have fit into these dining halls and feasting. As we see in the Megillah, Achashverosh makes a big deal out of showing off his wealth and feasting for 180 plus 7 days. And the eating and drinking is a constant theme. All right. The golden vessels that are at the first feast, we have here samples of them. But our sages tell us, just to give a little blink into the future, our sages tell us that there were vessels from the temple that were being used there. And this is very similar to what happened earlier with the Babylonians when they brought out the temple dishes or temple utensils. All right, so here we actually have a bowl with his name on it, discovered in his tomb, and Xerxes, who is either Achashverosh or Achashverosh's son. Okay, oops. All right, so that's just a little bit of a glimpse into that. So I want to talk about the major themes, and then we'll take a look. I would say there are 5 major themes that exist in the Megillah. If it is true that every book has meaning and every book has layers, the Megillah of Esther is for sure a concealed book. It is for sure things are not being said exactly as they are. There are allusions to things. And we find this in the discussion about why is it God's name is not mentioned. By the time they canonize this Bible, the canonization is happening, the Jews are already in the land of Israel. Can't they stick in God's name? Why is it not there? And if they're making it to Holy Scripture, so put in God's name. And the truth is, in the pseudo-apocrypha, these are works made either by Jews or Hellenized Jews at the end of the Second Temple period that were not accepted by traditional Jews as part of the Bible. They put in these, they made these addendums to the Book of Esther. They made these addendums of prayers and things like that because they wanted to add a religious element. Now, the Jewish tradition, of course, recognizes there's a religious element, but in the text itself, for some reason, there's no God. So that's number one. Why is there no God? God being concealed in the text. And we're going to look at two approaches. The other major theme is we're not talking, usually it tells us in the text, in the Bible, in the Torah, in the Tanakh, the Jews sinned, they followed their heart, they worshipped idols, they were corrupt, and God brought an enemy, and then they repented, and then God saved them. That's the whole book of Judges. The whole book of Judges is like that, and telling you, and throughout the prophets as well. You sin, challenges come, you repent, you're saved, you're redeemed, brought back, whatever it is that happens to the Jewish people. Or you have destruction with prophecies of redemption and return. But here you don't have that. You have a threat of death without any sort of reason, real reason being given. No solid reason. Somehow, though, the Jews celebrate this as this great miracle. All right, so we have the concealment of God, the concealment of causes and reasons for what's happening. The other subtext, the thing that's missing, so to speak, is Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, all taking place at the same time. Lots of discussion about return to Israel, going to Israel, rebuilding the Holy Temple. Here, nada, nothing. The others, so far, the concealment of God and the question of divine providence. Number two, Israel, temple. Number three, I would say there's a general message about exile and about the dangers of exile and the how we survive in exile. So we have to talk about that a little bit. And the enemy's anti-Semitism plays a role in this story as well. Let me see, I wrote I think I had one other element as well for the outline. I had, right. So I have also, there are other biblical stories that share a lot of language and themes with the Book of Esther, as if the author of the Book of Esther, the author of the Book of Esther, took primarily from the Joseph story a tremendous amount of language and imagery, because they are very much aligned. They are very similar in many ways. So let's talk about God for a moment. We'll start with that step, with God. So the Talmud asks, why is God's name not mentioned in the Megillah? So they give two reasons. One reason, they say, is because it was written as part of the Persian Empire, and it was something that they were afraid the Persians would put the names of their idols in instead of God's name when it's being translated and transcribed. In other words, this biblical book is not being written in the Holy Land in Israel, where it's for Jews by Jews. Here it's being written by Esther in Shushan, queen of the throne, with Mordecai, the great advisor. And if they put in God's name, it might be used for idol worship. The other perspective that is, so in that, if you look at the Megillah through that lens, so there are other things then that one could extrapolate and say, there's some sort of extra layer here where they're being careful about what the Persians are going to say and what they're going to do to the text. The next idea is that God concealed in nature. Now, this is, again, in the biblical text itself, if you just look at the surface, it's a story. To find God, you have to look. God is concealed in that story. So you're working with interpretation, even when we're looking at the most surface level of it. But what we're saying is that God is working within nature. You know, the story of Egypt. God takes nature, puts it in a chokehold, makes it cry uncle. In Purim, God puts his hand in nature and works it like a glove. In other words, it looks like it's nature. It looks like Esther's in the right place in the right time. It looks like everything is falling into place naturally, palace intrigue, different things showing up at the right time or the wrong time, depending who you are. But the belief is that God is there beneath the surface. So the whole story of Purim is about God acting beneath the surface. This is why in Jewish tradition, I know I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but the mystics would say that and it's quoted in other sources as well, that Purim represents this ultimate of divine energy. That when God overpowers the world, so it makes it look like God is more powerful than the world. But when God acts miraculously within nature, he shows that nature and God are not two separate things. And of course, there are miracles when God overpowers nature, but even the natural warp and woof of life is God. We just don't always get to see it. But now with Purim, we get to see it bubbling beneath the surface. Someone can connect the dots, and we're supposed to connect those dots. All right, so the hand of God, divine providence, God is watching out for us, and that God is concealed. That's another dimension of the Purim, the whole Megillah. Then becomes the question of the temple. The question becomes, is there a rebuke here to the Jewish people that they should have all gone up to the land of Israel? This can be debated depending on what period this happens in exactly. But I would say what's very clear is that they recognize if you look at the whole descriptions of the glory of Achashverosh that we open with, it uses all the same language of how we would describe the temple, which is why the sages and the rabbis said, oh, this is an allusion to the temple. He must have been bringing out his dishes, like the Belshazzar story, where the king of Babylon calculated the prophecy that the Jews had transmitted, that for 70 years they would be in exile. And they calculated that the end had come and redemption had not yet arrived. So he made a great feast and brought out all the gold booty from the holy temple in Jerusalem, and ate and drank and did whatever they did, desecrating it for their pleasures. And that's when the hand appeared on the wall. So our sages say this story of Achashverosh is a very similar story, is that he's also bringing out all his gold and purple. And some say the reason for his party was because of the temple, that he felt, he calculated the Jews were not going back. There are other interpretations too. It's not the only one. My point isn't if that was what his intent was or not. It could be for other reasons. But what we do see is the language of the text is very reminiscent of the Holy Temple. So it's almost like I don't want to say irony. It's a parody in a way, in a negative way. We're showing, all this pomp and circumstance, all for self-fulfillment and self-indulgence of the king, as opposed to a holiness where the gold and pleasures of this world are used for the glory of God, which is the temple. So in other words, there's an element there where you might think throughout the text that we're praising Achashverosh, but once we understand there are layers here, we're not impressed with his massive appetites. A man who makes a party for 180 days and then wants his wife to show off his beauty to his friends and then kills his wife and is always drinking. This is not someone we emulate. This is not someone we make a big deal. Although in the text, they talk about it as if it's praise and he's showing off all his wealth and his power. But behind the scenes, there's a snicker. There's a laughter at a man who kills his wife because of his friend, and then later on he kills his friend because of his wife. I mean, this is a person who has no control over his behavior. He lines up thousands of women to treat like commodities, like to to be his wife, his beauty contest. This is the opposite of holiness, of discreetness, of modesty. But in the story, it is told as if, oh, look at the praise. So we do have to look beneath the surface. I want to say that the word Megillah, which means scroll, Esther, the word Esther in Hebrew is related to the word concealment. Our sages say, now her Hebrew name was not Esther. It was Hadassah, like Hadassah Lieberman. Hadassah, which means myrtle, was a Hebrew name, but her Persian name, that either she took then or she had earlier, is Esther. Our sages ask, where is Esther, the name Esther, alluded to in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses? And they quote a verse from Deuteronomy where God says, on that day of anger, I will conceal my face. Anochi haster aster. I will surely be concealed on that day. My face will be concealed. In other words, Esther represents the divine concealment. When we speak of tragedies befalling the Jewish people, we speak of God hiding his face. God is always present. We just don't see it at times. And Esther represents that. But now if we read the Megillah like this, Megillah means to uncover. Esther means that which is concealed. So instead of reading it as the scroll of Esther, you could read it uncovering that which is concealed, which is both on a primary level, the hand of God. On the second level, we have this idea of the temple, that of where Jews should be yearning to be, not in the diaspora, not to be reliant on Achashverosh to protect you, not thinking, oh, you're so acculturated and assimilated, everyone loves you, you're safe. There's a message there about the precarious nature of existence in the diaspora. We have another Hadassah on here as well. Shalom Hadassah. All right. So, in other words, there's a subtext here as well. And again, we have to be careful because it's a subtext, and I'm trying to look at the simple layer. So we're doing the simple layer through the lens of how it's celebrated. It's celebrated as a religious holiday. And then we have the subtext, which is the background, other biblical texts. Because you take the Book of Esther, it's not a standalone book. It is seen together with the rest of the Tanakh. It's seen as one holistic whole. So once you view it that way, you have the key for the riddle. This is the key breaker, the code breaker. The Megillah is a code, but you have to look at other biblical texts that help you uncover it, which is the belief that God is beneath the surface, and that we need to rely on God, and that being in exile is precarious. Okay, the next element is the anti-Semitism, which is related to exile. And then the other element is the story of Joseph. So I want to jump into there, because there we can see the parallels in a very beautiful way. So I'm going to share another screen, if I can figure this out. Let's do this one. Okay. Everyone see that sheet? I'll make it bigger. If I go to view and I make it zoom, and I make it 150 maybe. Oh, page width is fine. There we go. Okay. So what we have here is a quote first from the Talmud that Esther and Mordechai are similar to Joseph. First, we find language elements that are related. And then we'll look at the story as a whole. All right, take a look here. Right on the left, we'll start with Joseph. Potiphar's wife, day after day, she tried to seduce him, and he refuses to listen. Mordechai, day after day, they talked to him about bowing to Mordechai, and he refuses to listen. Pharaoh removes the signet ring and gives it to Joseph. The signet ring reigns supreme in the story of Haman and Mordechai and Achashverosh as well. When Joseph goes up to power, he's dressed in robes of fine linen, and he puts a gold chain upon his neck. And the same thing here, we have the robes and the dressing, and he rides them on a horse through the square, and they cry before Joseph, and they cry before Mordecai, "Thus shall be done to the person the king wishes to honor." And it speaks of both Joseph was beautiful, and he found favor in everyone's eyes, just as Esther, I'm at the bottom of the page, 5:2 in Esther, 39:4 in Joseph. And we have here the similarities in language, which are an opportunity to use the Torah as the subtext to the story of Pharaoh. That just as Joseph is gathering food to provide, Achashverosh is gathering beautiful women. In other words, he sees them as commodities. All right. It makes this comparison in language between the embalming of dead bodies and the 12 months that they got the girls ready for Achashverosh. Really, if you read it in that lens, there's a subtext of total horror at the Achashverosh story about how he treats people and how indulgent he is, etc. When Jacob finds out about that Benjamin has to go down to visit Joseph before he knows that Joseph is Joseph, he says the language, "If I'm bereaved, I am bereaved." And the exact same construct, very, very similar, is when Esther says, "I will go to the king even though he hasn't called me, and if I perish, I shall perish." And it says lots of language that is similar. Now, here are the motifs, though, okay? The backdrop. Each of the Joseph saga and the story of Esther both take place in exile. Position of power, they rise to power. Both of them come from Rachel. The hand of God remains in the background of both stories. He's not mentioned at all in the Book of Esther. He speaks once in the entire 13 chapters of the Joseph saga. But, very important but, is Joseph talks of God all the time. Matter of fact, Joseph talks more about God than anyone else in the Torah. So if you were laying as a lens, you were laying as a slide on top of another document, you were lying the story of Esther on top of Joseph. What comes forth is the God-centric realization of Joseph, how he sees the hand of God, even though God himself is not talking. It's just Joseph talking about God, the religious person recognizing God. So an interesting element is, although both stories end with rise to power and immediate threat to survival, it's not a complete victory. The Jews of Persia remain in exile, and Jacob's sons stay in Egypt, and they're enslaved later. Now, as people, both of them have charm. They both have two names. One interesting thing, Joseph's name is Safnat Paneach, which in Aramaic means he who uncovers that which is hidden. This is in the Torah, which is the exact same translation as Megillat Esther. Megillat Esther, the scroll of Esther, means he who uncovers that which is hidden. So it's a very, very similar thing. And now the disguising of identity, Joseph is disguising himself the whole time from his brothers, and Esther hides her Jewish identity, and both reveal their identity. Joseph and Mordecai, we already started with, he refuses to be seduced. Both rise up, both are paraded with finery, etc. Both of them have their good deeds forgotten. And then with the king himself, the king also has similarities, and I don't think we have to go much more. Okay. I think we'll stop that there for a minute. I just want to open that up for a minute. If we choose to view, in other words, whoever, the Esther, who wrote the Book of Esther, if you look at the biblical text at the end of Esther, she writes, then it says she and Mordecai writes. It's not clear what are they writing, is it just Mordecai? Is it Mordecai and Esther? Is it Esther alone? So there's debate based on how you read the text, but it's for sure coming from them, and they're writing the story. And they're in a position where Esther is staying married to the king. And her question of dual loyalty, they don't want to be brought up. They don't want this. The Jew is a stranger in a strange land. And here she is, queen of the land. And the element is that there's a concealment there, either because they don't want, like I said, the idol worship to be integrated into the text, God forbid, or because of the fear of the kingdom, so to speak. But either way, the belief is there always was a subtext. And what's amazing is you find literally tens of parallels with the Joseph story. So if you lay the Joseph story underneath the Esther story, and it shines through like those slides, like a clear fabric that adds, that you could see through the veils. You see what it means, which the whole Persian veil upon veil upon veil is what's happening here. So that's the Joseph model that I believe textually is fascinating. From the text, the biblical text, just looking at those parallels you could find. And then the other element was the tongue-in-cheek or the negative look at some of the behavior of the king, of drunkenness and of over the top everything. On the other hand, they recognize the good that was also done by these people, much as Koresh, the Persian king, who had his own challenges, did great things for the Jewish people, let them back into the land of Israel. So you have that. There was, the temple. Let me make sure I don't want to miss the point I had here. Story of Joseph. And then there was another. Bear with me. Oh, here, this is the other one. Okay. Sorry about that. All right. So as far as the themes there, that God watches and protects us. So I would say a classical theme it's from a midrash, and maybe we should save these for later, but it really fits in with the rest of the stories as well, that the Jew in exile is in a precarious position. We believe that there's a shepherd and there's a sheep, and there are 70 wolves. And we are the sheep among the 70 nations. And when the shepherd is with us and guarding us, all is good. But when we remove the yoke of the shepherd in some way, and we choose to submit to the rulership of the wolves, so a sheep among 70 wolves doesn't do that well. They tell the joke of in Israel, there's they made a zoo for the coming of Mashiach. And in the zoo, you see different displays, and there's a wolf lying with a lamb. And they ask the zookeeper, how do you do that? He goes, new sheep every day. So the understanding that the sheep is going to be eaten by the wolf if the shepherd is not watching. But what makes the shepherd not watch? When we remove the yoke, which is why the subtext, if you look at the book of Daniel, how all the Jews worshipped the idol, except for the three friends of Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they don't. This is seen by some as the subtext of the story. It is being laid on that story, that the Jews in exile had gone along because of fear or other primarily, and they had acted as if they were believers in this idol worship. So they had given themselves over to the wolves instead of the shepherd. So even though, again, it's not explicit in the text, but that's another way of reading the story, that it is a reaction to the assimilation and to the idol worship, or maybe not always idol worship. Others say the fact that the Jews go to the meal, the feast, and they are so comfortable and eating from the same dishes that were in our holy temple, and now being paraded for some I don't want to say what, there's a wild party over here where he feels comfortable calling out his wife to show off her beauty, and other things going on that was not always the nicest, and they're having the dishes of the high priest according to this reading of the text. So again, we're stuck with subtext if we want to find meaning, because the story doesn't tell us the meaning explicitly as much as we try. We have to take advantage of other things. So I want to take one look at the structural elements that exist in the Megillah. So let me share a screen again. So there's something called chiastic structure, which is patterns in a biblical text. I'm sure in other texts as well. Let me make this a bit bigger again. View, page width. Okay, is that better? Are the pictures of people blocking anybody? Are people's screens? No. Okay. So if you take a look how this works, you could find this throughout biblical texts. They use this structure where it goes A, B, C, D, and then D, C, B, A. There'll be parallels between different structures. This one is a little longer. So you're going to see the same colors represent similar themes taking place. In other words, they are bookends. They're like half circles that end up meeting each other. The story starts out a certain way and there's a pattern. So for example, this is the whole Megillah. There's other approaches like this, but I'm giving you one example of how you can see the whole Megillah in this type of structure. Story one, how great and powerful he is. That's how it begins. Then we speak of feasts. Then Esther is taken to the king and she conceals her identity. Then promotion of Haman, raising above all the others. Then casting of the lot, war against the Jews set for the 13th of Adar. So everything seems to be going wrong for the Jews. It seems to be a setup for destruction. However, beneath the surface, God has already prepared the healing and the medicine before the illness. Esther and the story of Vashti and how Esther becomes the queen, although it looks like an expression of exile, Jewish girls being kidnapped from their homes and being taken to the king's palace, ultimately the seeds of salvation lie there. But if you look, this all seems negative until I. E, edict and reaction. The Jews hear about, they cry. G, Esther has the first feast. Haman leaves joyful. H, Haman consults with family, advice to topple Mordechai. Then you have the turning point, the axis on which the entire story of the Megillah rotates. The king cannot sleep, and he calls for his chamberlains to read from the Book of Records, and they read about how Mordechai had saved the life of the king and had not been rewarded, and he tells him to go out with the horse, and Haman should lead the horse. That is the turning point. As a matter of fact, in tradition, when we read the Megillah, that's when we raise our voice. But now if you look, everything unfolds backwards now. He comes home and he's all upset, and his family tells him, you're going to fall before Mordecai. So if you look at H and H, the same colors, right? So they're the same theme, just the opposite. Then is the second feast, Haman is hanged. When he thought everything was great, he left the palace after the first feast, which is G1. He left thinking, the queen loves me. She invites me and the king to the party. He is so happy. The Jews are freaking out. Haman, Esther, who we put all our hope in, is now hobnobbing with Haman. She must have gone to the other side. She must be a collaborator of the worst type. What were the Jews thinking? What was everyone thinking? But the flipping is happening beneath the surface. And then we have the new edict and reaction. So F and F are related. I'm going to make it a bit smaller so that we can see the whole thing. And then E and E, the war against the Jews is set. The war happens. Then the promotion, D and D, promotion of Haman. Esther comes before the king. And again, there's two feasts at the end. And we conclude with the extent of Achashverosh's kingdom. So what we have, this is one approach, and there are others as well, because we didn't put every part of the story, but one could see these touchstones where it seems like a disaster. The entire story of Purim is used, the language used, v'nahapach hu. Everything was flipped around. Here you can see visually, the whole story of Purim is a flip around. The whole Megillah is a flip around. The Megillah goes in one direction, the Jews are going off the cliff, and they are going for the rock bottom, and all of a sudden they're back up on top. What happened? V'nahapach hu, God flips it. So here, I'm going to paraphrase, because I didn't have time to translate into English, but if you see this is a themes that exist in the Navi, in the Book of Esther. What happens is the first Haman requests to kill the Jews, and he uses the language, if it is good for the king. And then when Esther pleads for them, she says, if it is good for the king, save their life. So that's a parallel. In other words, the destruction and redemption come about with exact same language. And then the giving of the ring, he gives it to Haman, and then he takes off his ring and gives it to Mordechai. And then he gives permission to Haman originally to do that, which is, I'm on the right here, it's in Hebrew, but what is good for Haman do? Then he tells Esther and Mordechai, do what's good for you. And then there's writing and sealing in each of them the books of the king, either to kill the Jews or to save the Jews. And they're sent out the exact same way. The same runners go out, and the same language is used, and the haste that they go in. And here's the best, this is one of the great parallels. The exact same language is used, but reversed. When the decree goes out to destroy the Jews, we read, Vayir Shushan Novoicha. And the city of Shushan was depressed. And then we conclude, Vayir Shushan Tzalav, and it was joyous, they're rejoicing, but the same words are being used. The Ir Shushan, how the city itself is rejoicing. And then again, so we have this idea all the way through. The tree that's made for Haman, and the exact same language is made when he is put upon it. And the same thing with, the same thing at the end with the clothing and the dress. So I would say, if we have to say these three primary themes, and then we'll close with a quick tour of Persepolis, if I could get my slideshow working correctly. The themes are God's hand beneath the surface, number one. Number two, another element is that related to that is the Joseph story can be read as an underlay of the entire story, where you see that Joseph recognizes the hand of God constantly. Number three, the issue of Jews in the diaspora, that is not a natural place. The natural place, if the prophets told you to go back to the land of Israel and rebuild the temple, that's where we should go. Whether it had yet happened then or not is not as important to us as the concept that ultimately that's where they were supposed to go. And the Jews of that generation did not heed the call ultimately to the same degree. Mordechai, later on, we do read in the Book of Chronicles, although it's a different name, but they say that's Mordechai. He returns to the land of Israel as well. So we do have some going back up to Israel, but the general idea of rebuilding the temple, and also saying that Athens is your Jerusalem, saying that Shushan is your Ir HaBirah, your capital city. The word Ir HaBirah, capital city, is only used in one of the places in Torah, Jerusalem. So the language that you have substituted the comfort of living here in the diaspora, which was a punishment because you're wealthy and doing well, and the Jews in Israel are struggling. Now, I'm not saying this is necessarily a modern day version of Zionism, because there you had the prophets of old where God commanded them to go back. So, there may be debate about, a religious Zionist, of course, would say that this is the message. Others would say the message is that even in exile, even outside the land of Israel. And even in Israel, you could still be in exile, they would say. We have to be able to, we have to recognize that God is here, God is present, and we have to align our interests with his and not try to assimilate and acculturate. And the element of anti-Semitism, we'll come back to a little bit, but I think that's more an expression of the displacement, so to speak, of the Jew, rather than being a story about that per se. So here's a quick.
So like, what is the purpose of comparing the Esther story to the Joseph story? Like what point are you making? And also, wait. And also, like for me, the Esther story, like I see her, I mean, I don't know if I'm projecting like as a hero, you know, a heroine, because isn't it thanks to her and Haman?
Sure.
Right. And like she and her cousin Haman, like somehow, you know, working it out through having trust in God, that they come out victorious ultimately, like she fasts and everything.
Right. So going back for a second, the reason for the overlay of Yosef, which again is just one way of reading the text, is that Yosef is the exact same story as far as in a foreign land, and he rises up and he withstands temptation and he saves the Jewish people. But there, he doesn't shut up about God. Every time he speaks to anyone, he says, God did it, God did it, God did it. Now, they didn't have that in the Megillah for different various reasons. But if you read it together and you see them as being similar, so now the echo from Joseph pierces the Megillah that you recognize. Oh, of course it's God's hand that caused Esther to come to the king. Oh, of course it's God's hand that caused Haman to overreach by his greed. Oh, of course it's God's hand that Mordecai overheard Bigsan and Cyrus. Oh, of course it's God's hand, etc., etc. In other words, Joseph is a
because when she's fasting, it's like she's not just doing it, she's doing
right,
it.
But the text doesn't. You're right, of course it is. To us, to any religious Jew, it's obvious, but the text doesn't say that. We're forced to add interpretation to make sense. What do you mean fast? Pray. Use the word pray. Doesn't say, just says pray, fast for me. It's like not even using any sort of element like that. And of course, Esther is the heroine. Esther is the heroine in the sense, 100%, that's why it's called after her name. Although Mordecai convinces her at the crucial point, but at that moment, there's also a switch.
And also, are you trying to say that just like in the Joseph story, like it ultimately, like what his brothers meant for bad at the beginning ultimately works out for good?
Exactly.
So it's similar in that way, like with Esther, what was intended originally bad ultimately works out for good.
100%, and we recognize it from God.
But I imagine you can find that in lots of stories. Like
yeah, but everything fits. The names, the words. If you look at the text I shared, right, it's like tens of examples where whoever wrote the Megillah took the language, exact Hebrew word, and put in the Megillah to describe. In other words, it's a description of Yosef, but it's, of Esther and Mordecai, but it's using the words. It's like if you wanted to make a tribute to, you took out from Shakespeare all the best quotes and you wove it into a modern day version. That's, you know, West Side Story or whatever it is you're doing with the Yosef story into the Megillah.
Shakespeare has key elements that recur in his play.
Right, but I'm saying later people doing it. In other words, Esther is written much later than the story of Yosef. But of course, so going back about Esther for a moment, there's also a flip there where you see everyone has a flipping point, a tipping point in the story. Esther is passive until she takes action. In other words, she's passive. Mordecai tells her what to do. Mordecai says, be quiet. Haggai takes her to be perfumed or whatever he gives her. And then all of a sudden, there's a flip. She takes autonomy and takes control, rather, of her destiny and all the Jewish people. And she tells Mordecai what to do. Somu alai, fast, make sure everyone else fasts. we're going for it. And she all of a sudden moves from being acted upon to being an actor. And really, more importantly, in a way, she gives up, and this is another discussion really, but I want to conclude so I don't go over my time, but she gives up on her personal life for the salvation of her people. Right. It's the ultimate in self-sacrifice. It's the opposite of the me generation. Esther is the bird in the golden cage. She doesn't want to be there any more than Joseph wants to be in the pit. And this is not for her. Nevertheless, she goes along with it, and because Mordecai thinks, he says in the text, that there's something here. Maybe there's some reason for this. I'm not sure why. And the assumption that we have is reading the text through religious eyes is that Mordecai has a prophecy of some sort, that somehow salvation will come through Esther. And when that moment actually does happen and Esther steps in, but now it's as if she uses that same language. She says, I'm going over to the king. I'm no longer a captive brought in. I'm now willingly, entering to the king's domain, and I'm going to ask him for favors. All of a sudden, I'm not just a kidnapped girl. I'm going to act like a queen.
Like she waits for God's perfect timing, and she prepares with the fasting and everything.
Well, the fasting proves, I want to close this idea. The fasting proves that she's relying on God, because if you want to look your best, the last thing you want to do is fast for 3 days. In other words, you want to make sure you have energy. You want to make sure that everything looks good. You're coming to the king. You haven't been called for 30 days, and the king kills people who come without being called. So she goes and she says, yes, I have to go to the king. I have to use the role of nature, the veil called nature. There's a veil, we call it nature. Within is God. She says the godly power is prayer and fasting. That's the real thing. I'm going to get dressed up, but the real thing is trust and faith in God. And she proves it by fasting before going in, which is counterintuitive. Honey, look your best. What am I doing here? I'm giving advice.
How come, like you said, or did I understand you, that people thought of adding God to the text?
We didn't, but some Christian Bibles have something called the pseudo-apocrypha, and the pseudo-apocrypha have the letter to Esther and dream of Mordecai.
But you don't mean it's added into the
not the Jewish text. No, but it's added to the Bible. Of some Christians have it in their Bible. It's called the dream of Mordecai, and it's called the letter of Esther. But my point is, even it could have been there were some Jewish sources that filled in the gaps, but in the Tanakh, we don't change anything. God forbid. That's the whole point.
That's forbidden.
We don't touch it.
Exactly. That's why I was checking.
Yeah. No, we don't touch it. We don't change it. But we have to understand, why is it not there? Why is it not hidden? And what does it mean? So ultimately, again, is one of the primary messages that we see for sure. Later generations saw that to look for God beneath the surface is one of the primary elements in the text. There are other stories that fill in the gaps to give other messages, which we will come to. So I'm sorry. So next week it's going to be how each one of us has this dynamic in a microcosm, how they see it as symbols as well. Not to take away from the literal, but that's the illusion. All right. If anyone has any thoughts or anything, you can email me. Have a wonderful night. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Take care. Same time, same place. And Friday night, Havdalah, 6:30 to 7 with our friend, Mr. Shabbos.
You mean Sunday night?
Saturday night.
You mean Saturday night.
Right, not Friday night, Saturday night. Take care, Andrew, Kathy, Sandy, Eric, Karen twice, Toby, and Harriet.